Hey everybody, my name is Tim, and today we're going to go through kind of a breakdown of this Zen Garden, Japanese Garden Ambience video that I created recently. There's going to be a lot of stuff we're going to touch on, hopefully a lot of little individual tidbits that might be useful for you, but the 6 main things that we're going to be talking about, kind of the categories, are going over some general info about how this scene was created and some of the tools that I used to put it together. Some tips about how I incorporated Fluid Flux 3 to make the water in the scene, including the floating leaves that float down the stream. A big headache that caused delays in rendering related to the use of Nanite in Foliage tool-placed meshes versus hand-placed meshes. Nanite quality settings to get the max fidelity out of your meshes for renders, and especially Foliage. Some quirks, let's call it, and problems with how directional lights work, and how to correct them. And a fix for foliage such as trees looking completely crazy and wavy when they're placed using the Foliage tool. So as you can tell, there's a lot to cover, so we're going to jump in and cover all of this right now. The first thing I want to talk about is how I used a landscape in this project that might be a little bit different than how people normally use it. I feel like most of the time when people use a landscape, it's just an object for a player to run across and cover a lot of ground. There might be a village over here or a mission that's going to be over here. And the landscape doesn't have to have a lot of detail to it in terms of sculpting. If you need to add a lot of fine detail, you'd probably use displacement or parallax occlusion mapping, or just add meshes that have all this detail. For what I wanted to do, I wanted to recreate kind of a Zen garden, Japanese garden that I had actually visited and had specific details in it that I feel like would have at least been the easiest to recreate if I could actually sculpt the landscape with a fair amount of fidelity. So let's look at the landscape real quick and I'll show you what I mean by that. So this is the environment with a lot of stuff turned off just so that the scene runs better, but this has kind of the key things in it. You can see it's like, again, maybe a couple acres in real life. Everything is scaled up by like 10, 20, 30 times, all the meshes. This is basically a normal size landscape from Unreal. And so this would normally be quite large. But in here, I wanted to have a lot of detail for sculpting with the landscape tools, and you can see kind of why. In the actual garden that I had visited, there was this creek that wound all through it, and there were paths that wrapped around and stuff. But almost the entire thing had this kind of log retaining wall that made a sharp edge where the water was. And so in real life, the ground would go kind of like this. It'd be flat, flat, maybe a little bit of hill, and then it would end pretty sharply at that retaining wall. And so I needed to be able to have enough fidelity to do that same kind of thing. If we go over here, where I've already made a little bit of a trench, you can see if this was a normal landscape and I was using it at like full size, everything was scaled down, we would be on a path that'd be a lot lower to the ground, a lot smaller, and you would end up seeing, I don't know if you can actually see it clearly, if I tried to make a sharp edge, you end up with these long lines because there just isn't a lot of detail in the landscape like this. And it would have created these like triangular, I don't know, it's like just a lack of detail there. And if I wanted it to come all the way out to that retaining wall and then drop without looking like this, I realized I needed to scale everything up so that relatively I had more detail to work with. So speaking of being able to sculpt the paths and do things like that, the way that I made these paths is with Landscape Splines. And I used a couple different materials on the landscape. There's this kind of grass material, then there's a flagstone here that has displacement, and it's a Nanite landscape. So right now, Nanite needs to be rebuilt. So if I was to select the landscape, go down to rebuild data, it's going to do its little bit of work, and then when that's all finished, this thing should have some nice little bit of detail to it from the displacement, which is really nice. And of course we have some like weird shadows because Nanite landscapes are funny sometimes. But one of the tools that I used to create this scene is a tool called IA Scatter. I've used it for many different things. It's a very powerful and actually inexpensive scattering tool. And I used it to create all of these different edge border things with the rocks. The way that this works, basically, in the way that I used it, you can use it to create a plane that scatters things down using kind of a trace. You can have it scatter things around a spline. You can have it go just on a spline. You can do a spline down. You can do all sorts of stuff. I was using it to just directly follow a spline, and then I placed the spline on the edges of the path. You know, anytime there's a path, I use this to place the border around it. The reason I use this tool instead of just using a landscape spline to populate meshes is because when you're using, as far as I know, when you're using a landscape spline to populate meshes along the spline, it's designed for something like a road or placing a gravel element that will kind of be repeating on, like in the center of the spline. And you have offset tools, so you can set it to go to the left or the right. But what I ran into when I was trying to do that was I had a bunch of these rocks here, and it was going right in the middle of the path. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just offset it and go over here. But what ended up happening is it didn't end where a normal border would end, like this. It would go, like it'd be offset over here, and then it would continue with the spline. And then I'd have this one over here continue like this. And it just didn't look right, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. And I already had IA scatter. So I was like, you know what? I know that'll work perfect. So I used that instead to make all of these edging pieces for the path. And it actually worked out great because I could easily edit them. What's also nice is you can take them, and when you make your path, you can then very quickly, they have a tool built in. Let's see, where is it? Open the IA scatter control panel. You click this, and you are able to basically bake those all as individual meshes instead of like a blueprint spline thing. And then, for example, here, I had a bench sitting here, and I was like, well, in real life, you'd take some of those edging pieces away so you could access the bench. So I was able to bake this, take those bricks away, and make it a little bit more realistic. And by the way, that's also how I did all the retaining wall stuff for the river. I used IA scatter. And I recognize that a lot of these logs are overlapping and don't look completely realistic. But because you don't really get a good clear look at it most of the time, I felt like it was good enough. And I could have tweaked it to make the distances like perfect and make sure that these didn't overlap really at all. But this was fine for what I was doing. All right, the next thing I want to talk about are these like stone walls that I'm using all around the garden. They're going all around the entire thing. And one thing that I noticed was an issue was as I was facing toward the sun, I realized that it seemed unrealistic, and I couldn't figure out why until I got closer, and then saw that as I got closer, there was sun shining through, even though it's supposedly a solid element. And these are Quixel Megascans things, and so when they're doing them, they scan them, and they don't scan the other side of it necessarily. So if I come over here, you can see it's basically one-sided and like paper thin. And so light is leaking through, the fog rays are leaking through, it doesn't look correct on the ground. The easy way to fix this, that would normally work just fine, is to open up the material and then go down. You don't even have to go into the master material, just go down to the material property overrides and then click two-sided. I'm going to move this out of the way and click that. And when it adjusts, you'll see, oh look, now our shadows are correct and we don't have light leaks or light rays coming through. So it seems like it's fixed. And that's what I did initially until I started looking. Let's see, where's the edge of my window here? There we go. It seemed like it's all correct until I was further away and I noticed these little sparklies. I don't know if it's coming through on the screen, but basically the geometry is so fine and all these little, connections between the vertices are so thin at times that I would get these little breaks in the seams, and you can kind of see those sparklies right there. That was happening because as I backed away, the nanite would start to get reduced, and it would lose quality, which would cause these seams to appear and let light through again. Even though there was no weird shadowing on the ground, the mesh itself would start to become somewhat see-through. And so what I ended up doing behind all these walls is, let me search for it here. There we go, cube. I just put a solid plain cube behind all these walls, and that solved the entire problem. It blocked all the light, stopped that from happening because there's no light shining through, and so any seams that might appear don't show up as little sparklies anymore. And so that fixed it. And all these walls have essentially just cubes behind them, and it fixed the problem. Now we're going to talk really briefly about using the modeling tools to adjust some of the meshes, specifically the bridges in this scene, to make sure that they fit with the paths the way that I needed them to. Because what I did is I made the landscape splines. I kind of mapped this all out to get a flow and a path layout that I wanted. And then I built everything around that. And so what that meant is all of these paths were curved, and they kind of were a continuous curve that rarely got straight. And so when I bring in these bridges that are just straight across from one side to the other, they wouldn't quite line up. And I didn't want to adjust the paths but I didn't have a curved bridge. And so what I did is I used the modeling tools to give a little bit of a bend to the bridge and make it fit. So I'll show you that real quick. You can see this bridge has a little bit of a curve to it where normally it would just be straight across. And the way that this works, let me come over here. Let's go on this side. We'll get a little bit better view. In case you don't have it enabled, just go to Plugins, Modeling, enable the Modeling Tools Editor mode, and then you'll get access to all this stuff. But if you go in here, Modeling, this one's already bent, but I'll show you really quick how to do this. If you go to Deform with the thing selected and go to Warp, I believe, there's a couple different ways to adjust this. All right, the Warp tool by default wants to just bend things upward. You can have it bend, you can have it twist, you can have it flare. So you see how this goes like this. It could be some really interesting results, but I wanted it to just bend because I only needed to go from like this spot and curve to go to this spot. So what I did, again, by default, it wants to try to curve up or down. Right now it's trying to bend 90 degrees up. If I went 90 degrees like this, it's going to bend it the other way. If we go back to this and we click down here, you can see this yellow line. This kind of illustrates the direction it's trying to bend things. So right now it's trying to bend it upward like that. I want it to bend the other way. So I can take my Y rotation and change that to 90 degrees. And now it's going to try to bend it that way. And we can go up here to the bend degrees. Now I've already bent this mesh for my project, so it's already kind of correct. But let's say I wanted it to bend the other way. I could go, instead of 90 degrees positive, we can go 50 degrees negative. And we're now bending the mesh going that way. And as soon as I hit accept, it will actually make those changes to the mesh, and now the mesh is that way. And it's not undoable. Well, it is undoable, but like the mesh is that way. So if you save and then leave, that's how the mesh is. But for this project, it was very simple. I knew I wanted it like that, and so I was able to hit accept, and it was great. All right, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of just general stuff and how I built the scene has to do with how the hierarchy works with edit layers for like the water layer, landscape splines, and just the normal landscape. And it's important because it's what allowed me to go through and do some sculpting on the landscape here, do a landscape spline, and then have a water body kind of take precedence over all of it. And in order to understand this a little bit better, we're going to go over to this other landscape that I've prepared with some sculpting, a water body here, and then we're going to add a landscape spline. I'm going to go to my landscape mode. So we just have the layer, just the default layer for the landscape, which is where we sculpt things. So if I go here, I can do some sculpting. You might not be able to see that because it's a really tiny brush. But we're able to do some sculpting on there. And then the water body is doing things like, whoops, moving a little too fast here, causing the landscape to deform to create that riverbed like that. But then if you want to have a landscape spline and have a path running around and also like intersecting this water body, what you would do is go to Manage, Splines. And actually the first thing you need to do is go to the Edit Layers and hit plus, and then Landscape Edit Layers Splines. Add that layer, and we're going to put this right here. Now that you're on splines, if you go on the landscape and you control click where there's this crosshair, you'll create the first point in a landscape layer spline. You can create then another point in a couple different ways. You can either hold Alt and then drag this widget out somewhere, and it'll create the next point, and you can basically just kind of keep doing that. And that can be interesting if you want to purposely just go and like cut through a landscape like this. Let's undo that. The other thing you can do is, while this is selected, control click on another part of the landscape, and it'll actually make that path, and then the next point you put will be on that point on the landscape like this. So it'll do whatever it has to do to reach there. So for this, it's making a straight line between that point and that one, and it's raising up the landscape to get there. It's overriding the sculpting that we've done. So if I click control click here, whoops, let's click that again, control click here, control click here. It's now kind of following the shape of the landscape, but it's also kind of cutting through it and flattening a path like this. Okay. Now, if we get over here and we want to cross this water, so we've got that point selected, we're going to control click here, control click here, control click here, and we'll come all the way back, put one more point here, and then we're going to control click on this point and it'll join it. The Bezier shape is a little bit weird, but they are joined now. But we have this completed path here. But you see, if I was to get out of this mode, you see the landscape, although it is controlling, it's overriding the landscape layer for sculpting, the water body is taking precedence over it. If I was to go back into landscape mode, select my spline, and I like raise this up, okay? It will raise up the landscape, the water body cuts through it, and then it continues kind of raising up the landscape and then continues. If I wanted this to be the opposite, where the landscape spline takes precedence over everything, I would want to move the order of this, because this is basically the importance hierarchy here. So you see now that I did that, the landscape spline will take precedence over everything. The reason this is important for me is because I wanted to have kind of a continuously moving path that was always curving, always moving, and then have the water cut through it so I could have bridges and stuff going across it. Somebody had mentioned to me that it might be possible to avoid having to install another plugin, like the water body plugin, to just use landscape splines for everything. The reason I do it like this is because that's kind of just how I've always done it, and it works for me, and I don't mind installing another plugin. But also, if you try to make everything with landscape splines, there's two things you should know. One is, if you try, so you have this landscape layer spline layer thing. If you try to make another one, so you have kind of your path, and if you wanted to do another one for your water, and you try to make another one of these layers, it'll say you can't do it, only one is allowed. Okay, well what you can do is you can actually make multiple splines on the same layer. So what you do is you just control click over here, you know, control click, and you've got another one going over here. And so what you can do, if we turn off the water, you can use these in conjunction with each other to like kind of make a river here. And that's fine. But what you end up losing is some of the fall off options, I believe. Like in a water thing, you can adjust how the side fall off happens. With this one, I believe it's just kind of a linear, you can tell it the width, but it's just this kind of linear fall off. With the water, you can have like a slope, you can have different angles for it. Also, with the water body, you have built into that the ability to make like a lake, a river, an island, and so you have some different sculpting tools that all work together for water bodies. If you're just making like a simple creek or something, go ahead, use a landscape layer spline, and that will probably work great. But if you want some of those other tools, and you don't mind installing another plugin, then using the water body plugin along with landscape splines can also be very useful. All right, now we're getting into the Fluid Flux info, and there's not a lot, but there are a couple things that might help some people out. The first one is actually something I have been unable to recreate since I built the scene, but when I built the scene, it was quite a big headache. So I'm just going to describe it, so if you ever run into this, it might help you. You can see here, when I have the domain active, and you can see kind of where it's scanning things, this red area is the top of the simulation area, like the height of it, that it'll detect. The green is all the good stuff that seems stable, and then the river and everything. What I ran into, because this is a nanite enabled landscape, because I'm using displacement on this path for the flagstone, if I had all the nanite data built, I would very often have these huge like red spikes just randomly across the ground. And this is not like, there's no crazy sculpting going on, it's just like these big rolling hills. There's no places that I felt like should cause instability. It would be like on flat ground that these spikes were happening. And I realized that if I went and sculpted something so that all the nanite data was gone, and it was not nanite enabled until I rebuilt the data, then all those spikes were gone, and it would look like this. Right now, this is fully nanite enabled, but for some reason there's no spikes anymore. So what I ended up doing was I would get everything sculpted the way I want, and then I would save the project. And what I didn't realize is if you save the project, it at the same time rebuilds the nanite data for the landscape. So it was very frustrating. I would go to like do something else and I would save and all the spikes would come back, like just before I tried to simulate. And I'm like, what do I do? I can't save because it ruins this. And so what I would do is I would save, take out the sculpt tool, put it to an extremely low value, and just do something on the landscape. And that would get rid of all the nanite data. And then I would do my little simulation thing because it would get rid of any of those spikes, and I would have a pretty stable simulation. And then I would go through this, get that all kind of saved the way I wanted, bake it, and then I could save. And then at that point, it didn't matter if the spikes came back. So again, I haven't been able to recreate it, which is really weird. But if you ever run into that, you could try to do that. Just get everything set the way you want, tiny little bit of sculpting after saving, so it negates the nanite stuff, and then do your stuff. Sounds weird, but it worked for me. One thing I realized pretty early on is that even though I'm trying to cover an entire landscape, I didn't actually need that much more resolution for the simulation domain because everything is scaled up to 10, 20, 30 times larger. And so if I kept this at a relatively low 1024 by 1024, that was plenty adequate to cover this. When I did that though, like the default for the area world pixel size is 20. And so this is what that domain looked like when I first put it in there. But again, because I can just make the pixels larger and not actually increase the resolution, I brought this up to 170 and it covered the whole space just fine. Part of the reason I did this was because at the time I didn't know. What I was doing was I was taking the resolution and increasing it to 4K, and that was like bogging down my system like crazy. Like I got 1 frame per second. And then after the whole project was done, I learned on the Discord from the developer that you can actually go to here under Editor, Height Map Update Frequency. By default, this is set to 0.4. If you set this to 0, that means that it will never update the height map frequency. So if you had this at the default, it would be continually updating the height map frequency, which is what bogged down my system. But if you keep this at 0, that means it'll basically do like 1 scan and that's it. And if you're not having a player run through or different things changing where you need it to be updating all the time, like me, I don't need it to be updating because the scene is just kind of set. So turning that off, I was able to increase the resolution and it was basically fine. So in the future, I know that I can increase the resolution and change that setting and not have to worry about it bogging it down. Another thing I ran into that was causing me some headaches was when I actually tried to run the simulation and have the fluid going down to fill up this whole creek. It's got a very, very slight incline or decline. So it starts up here and it goes all the way down to here, which is at the lowest point. So when I would run the simulation, the water would go, and I always like to fill up a basin so that it kind of runs out of a spot and doesn't risk sloshing out of here. But I would run this and it would go down, and for some reason it would like fill up everything kind of at the same rate. So the water would be running down, but then it would also fill up here and get this to overflow the banks before the bottom part would even get any water. And so eventually what I did, if you reduce the friction, the water will flow down all the way. But then I was like, it's not really rising very much. So how do I combat this? So what I did is I have my main source here, which would fill it up. And then I added more modifier actors. So you can see here I've got, however many this is, that's a wave actor. I've got like 5 of these things throughout. And so all of these things are contributing water throughout the scene. So I've got one there. I think there's 1 or 2 down here. And so these are all pumping in water from different parts so that when I run the simulation, it all kind of starts to rise together. And then when it got to a level that I was happy with, I stopped the simulation. So I would go to the simulation here. And if I set this to a lower number just so we can see it better, and I hit start simulation, you can see all of these going and they're all starting to fill. But here's the thing, I'm gonna stop it real quick. All of these sources are kind of omnidirectional right now. So all of these different things are sloshing out water going upstream and downstream. Eventually they can reach an equilibrium where they're going downstream. However, because these things are set to run continually, these are basically acting like pumps. If these ran for just a set amount of time, then they would dump all their water, kind of fill it up, and then stop. And then eventually the water would kind of start flowing down. What I did is I used these, like I said, to fill up the water to a level that I was happy with, and then I would stop the simulation. So if I ran this, let the water at least, connect here, and you can see how all these areas are starting to fill up. It's kind of slow right now. But if I was like, okay, right there, I'm happy with it. What I would do is go like that. I would create my data asset like I've shown in other videos so I can bake it. I would go here, export it, save it to that data asset, and then set it as the initial state. Now, the issue is, if you look here, if I was to bake this like this, the initial state would look just like this. It would have that lump of water rushing out and looking just like that, and I don't want that. So what I can do is I've actually done this already. So if I go here, TootSim, so this is the initial state. This is like with everything at a level that I would want, but all my modifier actors are still there. So what I can do is I can, let's see, let's go over to one of these modifier actors real quick. All right, do you see how the water is still kind of rushing out? Let's actually take this thing and hide it so we don't have the shadows. All right, there we go. So you can see that. You see how the water is rushing out like this. I can take all of my, let's do this so it makes it easier to find it, all of my modifier actors, okay? And I'll go into the modifier source and change the mode from adjust to add. And so I don't have to move these, I don't have to delete them, but I do have to go into each one individually. Adjust to add, go to the component, adjust, add. So the only thing now that'll act like it was before is the one that's way up top here. So the most upstream one. Let's go back to this here, and you can see very clearly that weird flow here. So if I go down to my simulation domain, and if I hit start simulation, you're going to see basically this thing is immediately going to level out. So let's go boop. That modifier is now gone, it's not doing anything. And the rest of the water is just kind of finding its equilibrium. There's still water flowing from the top one. So once this has reached a good state, I can hit stop again. We can look around, and there should be no more of any of this weirdness. Yep, it seems like it's all pretty level. And so now I can take this flux simulation domain, go down to scripted actor actions, export this. I created another data asset already called TootSim2, export it to that. And so what I can do is with my simulation domain, I can set that as the initial state. And I can also, like when I have my surface here, flux surface river, if I hide this and I go to my flux surface river, it doesn't have a simulation state right now. But if I select that one, this is with different material settings, so the water surface is going to look different than it did in the simulation. But it's using the same flow map as the simulation we just did. So now, I guess I could have let it run a little bit longer. There's still a little bit of artifacts, maybe from water floating upstream. But basically you get the idea. You can have multiple modifiers filling up a water area, get it to a certain spot, and then basically deactivate all of them except for one by changing the mode from adjust to add, and then letting it run for a few seconds and resaving it. And it allows you to do something like this. All right, so now we're going to talk briefly about how I use the Niagara like emitter system that Fluid Flux comes with in order to have leaves floating down the river. And by default, this thing, if you put the Niagara system in the scene, the mesh, like the thing that comes out of it, are just arrows, and you're supposed to replace that with whatever you're having float down the river. I wanted leaves to float down, but the issue was, by default, the elements just kind of pop in and then start floating down the stream, and they have a lifespan. I think the default is like 15 seconds, so the lifetime minimum is 15. I wanted these leaves to float listlessly down the stream kind of indefinitely, so I increased the lifetime of this to something much higher, just like a crazy number, like 100,000, okay? Because I want to make sure they didn't despawn. But I want to show you a couple things that made this work kind of the way that I wanted. And first, we are going to look at some of these leaves that are spawning. So this is the first emitter for these. And if you see here, so these leaves aren't just popping in. Let's wait for some to arrive. I guess I could have increased the spawn rate. But basically, these are entering small and then scaling up. There's one right there. It's going to scale up over a certain amount of time and then reach its full size over something like 5 seconds. And then it'll stay at that full size the entire time. There's one right there. It's going to scale up and eventually reach its full size. So that's one thing that I added, was the ability to scale up instead of just pop in. And then I also added a slight rotation to all the leaves so that they aren't just floating, you know, like rigid things going down the stream like that. And I'm going to show you just briefly those things that I added to this. So this is NS Flux default. When you add the Niagara stuff, go here, BP Flux Niagara Actor. When you add that to a scene, you get this. And so it's a blueprint. And if you go in, right now this doesn't have a Niagara system assigned to it, so that here, let's select this one. There we go. NS Flux Leaves. This is the one that I made. By default, it'll have that one right here, Flux Default. And so a couple things that I changed. Let me try to split this so we can look at them side by side. So by default, I'd already kind of started to modify this, but then I undid it here. All right, there we go. So it's got a mesh renderer and a sprite renderer. I deactivated the sprite renderer and only used a mesh renderer. I have a leaf asset in here. Let's click on this. By default, it's got this arrow asset. I made it, let's see here, let's look at mine. Initialized particle, I changed the lifetime minimum to 8,000 and then 10,000 max, so it lasts a lot longer. I did a mesh rotational force that I added to it. Right here, it doesn't have that under particle spawn. Okay, so I wanted to just make sure it had a little bit of rotation, so I have it doing that. A minimum max, so I have a random range vector, and it's only rotating on the z-axis. So they'll all be rotating slightly differently. I think along with that, it kind of makes you kind of resolve it by applying initial forces here. It has a scale mesh to size element right here in the particle update section, but this has like some math and some other things that I don't understand. I didn't want to touch that or mess with it. So I basically just deactivated that, did my own thing here, added a scale mesh size, and then I did vector from float and then float from curve so that I could have this go from 0 to 1 over a certain amount of time. And so by default, this goes from 0 to 1, if you do this, over the lifetime, the normalized lifetime of the particle. And so if I have the particle lasting 10,000 frames or 10,000 seconds, it's going to scale from 0 to 1 over a long time. So I just had to go and drag this second keyframe for 1 way the heck back, so it only took a few seconds instead of like minutes. So those are the main things that I adjusted for this. I don't think I really did anything else to it, but that allows me to have the mesh scale up when it's born instead of just popping in, and then last a lot longer and have a bit of rotation. The other thing that I did, let's take this, put it there and hide it, is there's a lot of these emitters throughout the scene, because what you'll see, sometimes things get trapped, they form little lines as they go. Most of the time they flow just kind of down the middle of the river, but you'll see all these boxes here are more leaf emitters. There's one under the bridge here. There's one over here. These other ones aren't showing leaves because they're just not turned on, because it kind of can bog down the system. But I have these things scattered all throughout wherever I would want leaves to make sure that there were leaves. Like some of these emitters are really wide. I wanted them to cover a long spot, along a section of the river. There were parts of this, if you look in the video, where they would actually end up forming just like a single file line and then even swirling just because of the natural flow of the water. And so to kind of get around that, I just had a bunch of these things all around. And that's why it was important to have the leaves scale in over time rather than just pop in, because these things were actually going to be showing up partway through the river. What I want to talk about next was honestly the biggest headache in this entire project. Designing this whole thing and laying it out, getting all the foliage in place took maybe a week and a half, and it felt like it came together pretty quickly. But then rendering it out with no errors took maybe another week and a half because of just all these insane things that kept happening. And it all centered around nanite versus non-nanite meshes. Now I'm working in Unreal Engine 5.7, which has the ability to use voxelized foliage to maintain a really great visual quality by voxelizing the stuff and then making it fuller, higher quality as you get closer. However, that requires you to have full geometry foliage that's actually modeled and it's all there for real, not just an opacity mask on a plane or something. I don't have any assets like that, so I'm using kind of the old style opacity mask for all of my trees and bushes and grass and all that. And because I have probably millions of instances of plants, I had to use nanite for anything that I could. And what I learned was, as I was rendering things, sometimes there would be entire sections of bushes or trees that would not show up in the render at all. And then I go back to editor and I'm like, it's all here, why isn't it rendering? And so I'd make some changes from nanite to non-nanite, and then these things now show up, but then other ones would just be insane, and they would have leaves that were 4 feet wide, and the material would cause it to ripple like a crazy dream. And so what I learned was anything that was placed with the foliage tool had to be nanite enabled, and anything that was hand placed for some reason had to be non-nanite. And there were some meshes that actually worked fine as nanite or non-nanite, but they had to be, I had to have two versions of it, basically, because there were some times when I wanted a tree right here, and I wanted this thing to be just like this and rotated or whatever. And I know you can do that by using the single instance mode in the foliage tool, but sometimes it's nice to just do it all manually and, not work through the foliage tool. So, like, for example, if I had this tree that I wanted to put a bunch from over here in kind of this little grove, I would have a nanite version for that, and then I would duplicate it in the content browser, and then make a non-nanite version and use that for hand-placed things. So all that together eventually caused this thing to render properly. But it took a lot of time to figure that out. And if somebody knows why that's happening or what I did wrong, I would absolutely love to know how to fix it. While we're on the topic of nanite and trying to maintain the highest quality possible, I want to talk about the basic settings I use to try to keep a high quality for my foliage, like trees specifically. With hard surface things, nanite is great because when it simplifies stuff, it doesn't change the overall volume really, like with rocks or logs. If it simplifies it, it just makes it a little bit lower poly, but it doesn't seem like it disappears unless it's like incredibly far away. With things like trees, where there can be sometimes tiny little branches and leaves, as nanite starts to reduce the thing, you lose that volume sometimes pretty quickly. And it happened in some of my renders where the camera would be on one side of the garden and you're supposed to see to the other side of the garden, but then there'd be a lot of trees that look like they have no leaves at all until you get close to it, and then the leaves would appear. So using these settings, it helps force it maintain the volume and keep the highest quality no matter where you are. It does make the scene run incredibly slow, but you get to keep all that quality. So basically, here's the settings. Position, precision, normal precision. These things are just auto by default. Normal precision, I will say I don't know what this ideally would be at. I just set it to 10 bits and it seems to work well. The main thing here though is position, precision. This is set to auto by default. I have been bringing it down to 1 centimeter or a little bit lower, and that helps kind of force it to maintain a higher quality for like keeping leaves and stuff there. The fallback target, I think by default is relative error, but then bringing this number for it down to 0 helps maintain the highest quality shadows. The max edge length factor, this took me a while when I first learned about it to figure out what it was. I was doing a video, I did another one in like a mountain valley where a lake walk goes around this lake, and there are a lot of pine trees with pine needles. And the issue was when they were a certain distance away, with the max edge length factor set to its default, which I think is 0, the nanite would simplify it to the point where it would become like impossibly narrow, but it would glitch and cause like a single pine needle to shoot out 20 feet. And so it looked insane until you got close, and then the nanite quality improved and it went back to how it should be. So taking the max edge length factor forces it to consider all these different little edges and keep them intact down to a smaller size rather than oversimplifying it and having a glitch happen. And then because 5.7 now has the ability to use voxelized foliage, this may change as newer assets come out, but I've still been using preserve area and then just applying all those changes, and it's helped me maintain the full quality basically for foliage like trees. Last thing about nanite is if you find as you're moving around that your nanite enabled meshes are having that LOD transition happen too close to the camera. Like I did a project in the wintertime where it's walking down this path and there's all these snow-covered trees, and these were all nanite enabled trees. And for some reason, when nanite simplified the mesh, there's like snow cap on top of these pine needles. And when it was simplified, the pine needles would pop through the snow on top of the branches. But then as it got back to full quality, the snow would be on top of the pine needles. And it was extremely obvious, and it was happening close enough that you would definitely notice it. And so I found a console command that allows you to move back, like further away, actually kind of any direction, I guess, but I used it to move that transition point further away from the camera. So it's happening out of sight, so that by the time we got to that point where we were closer to the trees, it was already full quality. And that console command is r.nanite.viewMeshLODBias.offset, and then you set your value. So for that project, the value that I set was -500. So it moved it, I think, 500 units away, and that was far enough away that I wouldn't see that transition happen. But I used that console command in this project as well because the same kind of thing was happening. Certain meshes were adjusting in quality too close, and I had to move it further back. All right, moving on to directional light settings. This is something that, again, took me a little while to figure out when I first learned it, and I feel like it could be useful for you. With a directional light and volumetric fog, like light rays coming through tree branches or around a building or something like that, they look beautiful, but it can be confusing on how to enable it. So in this project, I'm using ultra dynamic sky, but these settings basically apply to any directional light. You have a different interface in ultra dynamic sky. So in UDS, The way you turn on volumetric fog is you can just search for volumetric or just go down to the volumetric fog section and turn it on. And now you have volumetric fog. But you'll see right now in this scene, although I have the fog, I don't have any pretty light rays. The way that I enable those is by going down into the sun component, and I already have volumetric searched in the bar here, but you go down to cast volumetric shadow and click that on. And now, as I move around, you'll see these light rays. That's how you get the light rays turned on. This is just a directional light that UDS is using. It's not like it's a special UDS thing. You can do this in a directional light on your own. And then the next setting, let's go back up to the main thing here. How much the light gets scattered by the fog, or how much the fog gets scattered, I guess, whatever. The light gets scattered by the fog. Sun volumetric scattering intensity. The default on this is pretty low, okay? So you get like a little bit of light rays if you're really looking for it, but if you want to intensify this, go to the volumetric scattering intensity for the sun, and I had it at 50 because I wanted it a lot. And so you're basically changing how much that sunlight will be scattered by the fog. It's very similar to just increasing the fog density, but it is different. So that's how you get those light rays to appear. One other directional light tip I have for you has to do with shadows far away not showing up like they should. You can see on this Japanese temple thing here, I had a bunch of them surrounding the map, but I've hidden all but this one for simplicity. You can see that the sun is right here on the other side of it, and then the main building's here, and then these rooftops are still receiving sunlight, and they shouldn't be. If this was realistic, this would all be in shadow because of the building. This took me a long time to figure out, because I've never had to deal with this before. But the solution came down to going into the sun component for ultradynamic sky, searching for cascaded shadow maps, and there's a setting in here called dynamic shadow distance. By default, this is set to 20,000, so it's 20,000 units away is where the dynamic shadows start happening. So if I was to fly toward this building at 20,000 units, right about there, the building receives shadows like it should, and this part of the rooftop is in shadow. So what I had to do, I'm going to go back here just so you can see it, I increased this number to something way too big, just big enough that it would cover everything, which happened to be 130,000. And so now that is receiving shadows on the building, it's casting shadows on the ground like it should, and it fixed that kind of long distance shadow problem. This next tip has to do with integrating a unique skybox material, like a really cool looking sky, with something like ultradynamic sky. I wanted the directional light from ultradynamic sky and kind of the ambient stuff, the fog, everything that's built into it because it just looks so nice. But I wasn't thrilled with kind of the default sky in UDS. I wanted something that looked kind of more magical. And so I got a pack from Fab that had this. If I hide ultradynamic sky, you can see this. It's kind of more contrasty than it should be. But this is the sky that I wanted. Okay, it shows that more pink when everything's combined, but this is it. It's got some really cool clouds. It includes like a flow map and stuff, which I'm just not using. But to integrate that with ultradynamic sky, by default, it's just like one or the other. The skybox pretty much takes precedence over ultradynamic sky, but you can make them work together. And the way you do that is to go into the skybox thing in the material here, open up the material, go to the main material, and then change the blend mode to additive. I think the default is opaque. If you change it to additive and then save it, then it just combines its own colors and design and everything, the image, with ultradynamic sky, and you get the best of both. So you can still use the controls in ultradynamic sky with a beautiful sky texture by doing that. Now for this next tip, if you're looking at my screen at these trees and wondering what in the world are these trees doing, that's the same kind of reaction I had when I first started using Unreal Engine and used Quixel's Megascans trees, like the black alder and Norway maple, that kind of thing. For some reason, the first time you use a new engine, a new version of Unreal Engine, there's a certain setting you have to change in order for these things to work properly. These use a certain material function called simple wind that is incorrect when you're using it with the foliage tool. If you're placing these meshes by hand, they look just fine. They sit there, they do the wind thing just fine. But for some reason, again, using the foliage tool, it looks insane like this. And I'm going to show you how to fix that. So I've already got some of the stuff opened up. What I've done, by the way, these are not Quixel assets. These are like a different kind of Japanese pine tree that I'm using, but I've copied the simple wind material function into them because it does give a really nice simple wind animation to kind of any foliage. That's another tip that we'll talk about. But in here, if we go to that material function, so if I go into here, this is the black alder, this is the Quixel tree, and you go into a material. Okay, this is one of the materials for one of the parts of it. Go down to the parent material, open that up, and then you go down to the master material for that, for foliage. Go into that, and in the section, let's see if this will actually wake up. There we go. The simple wind material function. This is the part that I copied to my other stuff, but we have to go into this, and then when we open up that part, there's a certain part of that called main rotator. And then you look for object pivot point. Double click into that object pivot point, you get into here. And then there's this part right here where you have this constant, and then it goes out to these two different things, and they go into the different outputs. This top one, if you change source from local space to instance and particle space, and then the bottom part here, the destination, to absolute world space, and hit apply, watch these trees. It might take a second once I hit apply. Oh, come on, don't freeze. There we go. I hit apply. It's going to go, because this is the master material. It's in the material function for the master material. All this stuff will suddenly behave as normal. It's a setting that I believe anytime you use a different engine version, it goes back for some reason to that way. But once you change that material function here, then it's good to go, like for any other project. So it's not even like per project or per use of this material. It's just good to go for other projects in this version. So now you can see these things are swaying like they should, and it's all behaving properly. All right, and the last tip for you today is that you can take, if you have access to those Quixel's Megascans trees, you can go into that same material. You know, you go into the MA foliage, you drill down into the master material, find the wind section, and copy this material function, simple wind, into a material that you have for a mesh that doesn't have any animation. And you can get a basic wind animation going. So if you look at this tree, this is a tree asset. Let's see if this thing will wake up for me. This is a tree asset that did not have any kind of wind in the material. It was just basic, you know, textures on the thing. But I get to have this little bit of sway, and I actually can increase the intensity of it if I want, because I copied that into the material. And if you look here, if I go into the material for the trunk, for example, I have animate foliage, the strength, the noise strength, all these parameters available to me because all I did, here's the material, normal, you know, diffuse, whatever this is, ambient occlusion, normal. But then you just take the simple wind thing, plug the WPO tree into the world position offset. Literally, that's all you have to do. Save it, make an instance of your material, and now you get access to all these parameters, and you can animate your foliage using that material function from the Quixel's trees. Well, that's all I have for you today. I know it was a lot of different things to cover. Hopefully you got a couple of little tidbits that you can take and implement into your next production and make things run a little bit smoother. By the way, I will freely admit that I'm not an expert in this. I'm just trying to figure it out. So if you saw anything in this tutorial that I'm talking about incorrectly, or that there's a better way to do something that I'm showing how to do, please leave a comment. Let me know the better way to do it, because I don't know how to do all of it. I'm just trying to figure it out. So I welcome that feedback and that instruction. I'm always open to saving time and saving headaches. So until we meet again, have a great day. Why am I thumbsing up?